I've been avoiding talking much about these dispositive motions, the motion for summary judgment and the motion for judgment on the pleadings, because they're so heavily redacted. When you have that situation, points can't be made completely, we can't see all the evidence, but it's taking so ridiculously long to get things unredacted and unsealed. These documents are piling up fast, so I went ahead and downloaded them, and we're going to do this today with what we have. I'm covering the first part of the motion for summary judgment. It was originally filed last month on the 13th, but due to Daddy Lyman's favors to Blake, and now also to Sony, these things are still shamelessly unsealed and unredacted. Normally, they're only sealed for a week. This is over a month and counting. I do wonder if a judge not so closely related to Hollywood and not holding so many Hollywood stocks would care this much about Sony or celebrities to let these things hold up in the safe haven of his decisions for this long. It's made me think more about his stock. I was the one who broke the story originally about all of the Hollywood stock that he holds, and also how many of that stock has contracts or is otherwise tied to Ryan. For example, Ryan holding first look contracts. The companies like Paramount have paid tens of millions of dollars in advance for projects he may put out. With Hollywood suffering the way they are, they really need him to come through with some hits to make it worth having spent tens of millions of dollars. And yet what have we been seeing? We've been seeing his already small list of projects being met with delays, cancellations, or downgrades from theater to Netflix. With all that in mind, looking back at Judge Lyman's finances, because judges have to be very transparent about things, he claimed that he made about $4 million per year at his previous law firm. He also had just under $40 million in stocks. Federal judges are on a strict, disclosed salary. All of them. Doesn't matter where they're from, it's the same. It's a set standard. He's on the lowest level for federal judges. He's a district judge. That makes his annual salary $247,400. It's a decent salary, no doubt. But when you're used to $4 million a year, this is a fraction of that. Savings, properties, and stocks are therefore important to keep up the living standard that these judges were used to before they became judges. Now, I'm not making any accusations here. I'm stating some facts. Lyman's poorly invested Hollywood stock are all either taking losses or earning so low that they've not even needed reporting since he took his judgeship. This is the exact reason that these things are, number one, by law, openly exposed to the public for us to see, and two, the reason that judges are supposed to recuse themselves if anything looks improper. I ask again, would any other judge not so connected to Hollywood, for example, having a brother as a Hollywood director or having so much Hollywood stock, give this much leeway to celebrities and production companies like Sony? Or would they have to submit to the same standards as literally everyone else? If the standard for unsealing and unredacting is a week, why was Blake Lively, Sony, and all the celebrities and officers of production companies, why were they given 6 weeks? 6 times the standard. It's not normal and it's not fair. Blake's team has had all the time in the world to file these frivolous sanctions motions, but they've had no time to sort through sealed, redacted information that was not new discovery, things that they had for some time. You can mention third parties, but these third parties knew what they'd provided to the court. This couldn't have been worked out quicker, and by the same standard, literally everyone else has to follow. They knew all along that they were going to use these things in the case. It's ridiculous, the amount of time they were given. Wayfarer's extensions, by comparison, are rarely granted, and when they are, they're a few days at best. This is the most lopsided case I've ever reviewed. Wayfarer was able to bring a very solid motion for summary judgment. We see how clearly it's outlined here in the table of contents. Unlike the motion for judgment on the pleadings, this one is based on evidence. This is like a mini trial. This outlines the case and supports it with the evidence collected during discovery. and the judge uses all of that to make his decision. If you've seen the conversations I've had with Omar, one thing stands clear. If there's any question that a reasonable juror might find the evidence compelling, it still has to go to a jury. So the chances of them getting every single one of these arguments granted in a motion for summary judgment is very slim. But I think everyone agrees at least some of these causes of action will be done away with. But that's what they've presented here as the different causes of action that Blake has sued them for, and their arguments against each of those, together with evidence that's been collected during discovery. We see some excellent reasoning here. For example, it was a sexually charged film with adult themes. That was so with the book, that was so with the script. There's other things that address her contract claims. Things like she was an independent contractor and not an employee, and the contract itself was never even signed. It's very reasonable and very well put together. Moving on to the second document of the three, we have Blake's response. In spite of all the time spent in discovery, all the help that Lyman gave her in his decisions, in spite of her hiring an ex-CIA agent, she has even less to support her claims than she did in the beginning, not more. Why? Because the actual discovery has done more to disprove her claims than it has to help her. So instead, she resorts to rehashing the same tiresome old claims, but giving them salacious descriptions to try to make them sound worse. This may fool PR, but it certainly does not fool a judge. We see this accusation against Jamie Heath has now progressed to, he insisted on a meeting while Blake was undressed as if he planned it that way, and now we have gawked at her body, where before we had he made eye contact, that she acknowledged was not on purpose and not him copying a look. Justin is now fixated with Lively's weight, in spite of the fact that he asked the trainer one time so that he could prepare a scene in which he was going to have to deadweight lift her. She's also pushed the blame to Sony for editing her own version. For what is supposed to be an SH case with the side of retaliation, she spends very little time trying to prove SH. Why? The only reason would be a lack of proof, a lack of support in the evidence for these claims. Many of her original claims have had to be ruled out or downplayed, as video and audio recordings, depositions, and documents produced in discovery have time after time proven that she either lied or greatly exaggerated. Much of the claims that she's using here to try to refute and oppose this motion are a pile of hearsay that will not stand up to measures of actual evidence. She's still blaming Sony and Wayfarer for her and her vile husband's horrendous marketing. That's my opinion. Don't subpoena me again, Ryan Reynolds. I've gone through that horrendous marketing video that Ryan made with Hugh Jackman, where he and his mom literally SH'd Brandon and spoke at length about meth. Nothing in that video that probably cost millions had anything at all to do with the movie.
I could blow your mind, dog.
It is by far the worst marketing I've ever seen. But there they were, milking Wayfarer and milking Sony for themselves and their friends. We have stupid chats with Blake and her co-stars talking about extra body parts being a cookie. We have her drawing flowers with Brandon, who looks like he's about to fall asleep. We have them baking cookies, spending millions of dollars for nonsense that had absolutely nothing to do with the movie or the theme of the movie. It was a huge marketing fail. Then, of course, the hawking of her products. There's no way on earth that any production company would have wanted that as marketing for such a film. None of those things that Ryan Reynolds' marketing company brought as marketing. They were simply a glimpse into the sick minds of Blake and mostly Ryan. That's my First Amendment right to express my opinion. Do not subpoena me again, Ryan Reynolds. It was paid for by Wayfarer and by Sony, and it was a colossal fail to anyone with brains. It is the reason for the organic backlash against them. That look in the mirror that Brian Friedman famously talked about at the beginning of this case is all they needed to understand what a fail their marketing was. But no, they cannot accept blame for their own actions. Looking at this table of contents in Blake's opposition, just imagine this being your fight for your lawsuit, and this is what you have to work with. Some of these sound like, oh, maybe there's something there, and then you read it, and no, it's baseless hearsay and fairy tales. Look at how few of all of these pages are dedicated to the SH claims. That right there tells you everything you need to know. She's fighting for her lawsuit's life in this document, and this is what she's got. These are the very things that she will be presenting to a jury when this goes to trial, and this is what she's got. I don't know about you, but if I was a juror sitting on a case that I was told was about sexual harassment, and this is what I was presented with, I would have so many questions. And that brings us to the final document in these three, and that's Wayfarer's reply to Blake's opposition. This is the response that after Blake was given the chance to defend her case with all of her might and all of her evidence. As I said, this is basically what her case will look like in court, and it's a dismal look. These are all of the points that after she had a chance to argue her case, she didn't even address some of the things in the motion for summary judgment. Why? Because she can't. Anything she didn't argue is seen as abandoned because they were not addressed. Now we have things like she cannot prove actionable sexual harassment. They can say this because they've seen her evidence and her fight. She cannot prove actionable retaliation. Again, they've seen her response and her proof. There was not an adverse employment action. She cannot prove causation. There were no protected activities. She was an independent contractor. See, they made this accusation. She had a chance to defend it. Now they're saying her defense fails. She can't prove that they failed to investigate. Her contract claims fail. And then there's a long discussion about her contract. And then it goes on to the rest of her causes of action and how those all fail. We'll get a chance to see even more about this in the oral arguments. I said before the fact that he's given a courtroom and a time that it's open to the public makes it very, very likely that we're going to get to listen in again. But in those oral arguments, they're not going to be able to argue any new evidence. They can only argue what is in these documents. They can try to reinforce them. They can respond to questions asked by the judge. But basically, every accusation and every defense have already been included in these documents. This is it. It's not like she's saving something for later. This is her case right here in these motions. Those things have to meet the legal standards that we've talked about here and that many other people have talked about as well. These are high standards and nothing in here meets them. The writing in this document is an absolute work of art. It's very much worth mentioning her career. She has argued before the Supreme Court at least 3 times. The majority of attorneys never argue a single case before the Supreme Court, so it is not a small feat that she's been there 3 times. Of those 3 times, she has won 2 of them. This is huge. This is like if attorneys went to the Olympics and won gold. Participating in the Olympics 3 times and coming out with gold twice is huge. She's not someone to take lightly. In addition to these massive accomplishments in the Supreme Court, she's had many, many cases overturned in appellate court in the Second Circuit. If Lyman is going to be bothered by anyone on these teams, it's her. Judges hate to have their decisions overturned in appeal. A woman like this is a threat to his record, and I'm sure that she has been up and down the list of his decisions in this case, made a list, checked it twice, all the mistakes that she intends to appeal here. And if he's not worried about that, he's a fool. She's captured details in this response and spoke on them in a no-nonsense, brutally honest way that I absolutely love to see. This kind of passion for justice and calling things for what they are is what I live to read in filings, and especially to see in the courtroom. I cannot wait to see this woman in action. She, right now, in my opinion, is tossing gasoline everywhere, and I cannot wait to see when the match gets tossed. This introduction is a 10 out of 10. She read the case, and she's now reading Blake to filth. She's saying everything we've been wanting to see said, calling it all out for exactly what it is. Now, I've seen some nonsense on X because the Blake stans are getting nervous, those celebrity-worshipping idiots out there, and they're trying to twist this into Wayfarer trying to get off on technicalities because they don't understand the law. Let's get this straight right now. These are not technicalities. This is simply what I and many other creators have been saying for almost a year. Blake's claims do not reach the level of legal SH. It's a fact. It is not a technicality. It is the law. These simple-minded people who've been saying, you can't say that stuff in the workplace, who do not understand what is required to meet the legal standard of SH, are now running around in circles bumping into each other because the truth is finally being spoken. I've read to you from the jury instructions in California and New York. I've read to you directly from the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission website. These are the two main authorities to look for this. Not Actually Golden has done multiple videos explaining the level that must be met for something to be considered sexual harassment. And Blake's accusations have not ever gone anywhere near that level. But that's not all. The people that are saying it's a technicality are misunderstanding the bar. But also, they're forgetting the fact that Blake has been proven to be lying in so many cases now that anyone who still believes her actually makes me worried about them. And why do I say that? Because, as she says it here, Lively spills lots of ink attempting to conjure up factual disputes, but the material facts are undisputed. So all of the ink that she spilled, that was all just PR, meant to taint a prospective jury and try to build up Blake's ruined reputation in the public, just do not cut the mustard. She's launched a massive legal campaign to address minor grievances, all of which were resolved during production of the film without the need for any litigation at all. Now, what she means by that, as a part of the legal standard for sexual harassment, is whether or not something was resolved. So even if there were instances, did they continue or were they resolved? Now, this is not an admission that this stuff reached the standard. This is just saying, even if it did, it was resolved. That makes it ineligible for a sexual harassment suit to be successful. I love the way she doesn't mince words. She recites a litany of supposed harassment, ranging from yelling to defensiveness to a conversation that Blake herself initiated, and we have this redacted, to an incident she assured at the time was a non-event, but cannot say any continued after she asked for them to stop. The parties worked together to produce a successful film that brought her not only riches, but an extraordinary set of professional accomplishments that she touted to the PGA as a rare achievement for a woman. That's important because it shows that there was no adverse employment action, because it shows that there was no retaliation in the workplace. Retaliation leads to things like reduced salary or reduced chances in the workplace, demotions, firings. Hers was the opposite. She's expanded her accusations to include discrimination, arguing, and even claiming that her contract was violated, even though she never signed it, and despite her near control over the production, claiming that she was merely an employee. She claims that Wayfarer unfairly resorted to professional PR firms for guidance, even while she and her husband openly badmouthed Baldoni and ginned up a flurry of negative press against him. These are no longer just allegations. They have the evidence for all of these things. She alleges a massive smear campaign, but fails to point to a single falsehood any defendant uttered against her. That's important. Where are the lies that were spread in order to support defamation? And then she says it simply. Blake's claims do not meet the requisite standards. There's a standard for a reason. These legal standards are there so that frivolous cases are not brought to the court. Our courts are already filled. Imagine what could be brought if these standards were not set so high. And so she said, summary judgment should be granted. And then we get into the legal arguments. She says nothing in her opposition overcomes the clear reality that she alleges low-level behavior, trivial grievances, and petty slights. And though this may be bothersome, it doesn't rise to the level of a discriminatory, hostile work environment. I've been a boss. I've raised my voice. I've gotten angry with employees. I think most of us have seen our bosses get angry and yell. That does not prove what she's supposed to be proving here, sexual harassment. Just because a man yells at a woman does not make it a sexual attack or that it's based on gender. Then she says that it boils down to a comment about, and that's blocked out after she raised the topic and before she agreed to work on the movie. Now, the redaction there looks pretty short, so my guess was that it was about circumcision, but I don't know if that word would fit there because we found that a conversation was held at Blake's home with Ryan around and many, many more people around when Blake was still pregnant. She was pregnant with her first son and brought the conversation about circumcision up. That is what Blake distorted into Justin supposedly describing his genitalia. These are the kinds of things that are going to make a jury angry. They're going to hear an accusation that he described his genitalia, and then they're going to find out this is the setting, this is what actually happened. When they hear things like this one after the other, she is going to be seen as an absolute joke. Even the most prudish person sitting on that jury is going to see that as ridiculous because the accusation does not match the reality. She moves on to discussions about sex and sexiness that in a normal work setting would be shocking. However, what were they doing? They were discussing and collaborating about how to depict an intimate relationship and sex scenes. It's expected to have these conversations when that's what you're collaborating about. If you're going over the budget in an accounting firm, of course it's inappropriate. But you're about to simulate sex on screen, and you're going to get squeamish about discussing it? Then we have the remark about her weight. We've discussed this at great length, but she mentions that this remark was made to a person that was uninvolved in the film and was made off-set. This can't even be depicted as a workplace incident. It didn't happen at the workplace, and it didn't involve an employee or an independent contractor of any kind. This had nothing to do with her job. And this line, she now attempts to make Heath the poster boy of sexual harassment. The complaints that she's been making about Justin, now she knows. These are all on camera, on mic. She's not going to get away with lying. As soon as she makes a claim, all he has to do is pull out the video. Because the video in its entirety is part of evidence now. Anything she says, it will not be new evidence to pull it up and show that's not what happened. He's done it already a couple of times, and it makes her look foolish every time. So now she has to be careful about what accusations she makes about Justin. What does that leave? It leaves Jamie, because most of her conversations and situations with Jamie were not during filming. That means he doesn't have what Justin has, this handy hours and hours worth of video from multiple angles. So now he is the poster boy. She's putting all of the accusations onto him. I already mentioned this about what this simple situation of Jamie entering her trailer has blown up into now because she's desperate. Now the actual thing is disputed with him saying he did not look at her saying in the beginning she said he made eye contact. Now she says he gawked at her. But the undisputed part is that she told him, I'm not saying you were trying to cop a look. We also have this ridiculous birth video accusation. What cannot be disputed is they were discussing a birth scene in this movie. He didn't just whip out his phone and say, here's my wife naked. What else do they mention? Jamie had showed this also to Justin, who found it inoffensive. Most of us have seen it. It was posted to their Instagram. There was nothing offensive about it. It was beautiful. And as she says, it is remarkable that after months of discovery, Lively cannot muster anything more to justify the tremendous legal and judicial resources devoted to this case. It is even more remarkable because whatever concerns she may have had were fully resolved once she raised them. Even Lively does not meaningfully dispute that the entire second phase of filming, including all of the intimate scenes involving Lively, occurred without incident. So what is this case even about? She continues by noting that nothing points to gender, and I love the way she expresses her disbelief and disgust at the accusations. But gender is a prerequisite for a sexual discrimination claim. It has to have been aimed at her because she is a woman. She has not been able to prove that, and she herself has had to concede that the conduct that she says she was so offended by was also there involving some men. Her own admission takes away her accusation that it was because of her gender. So we saw the hugging culture. We've seen the videos that were released of Justin hugging men. In one of the cases, he hugged the actor that played young Atlas and physically refused to hug young Lily. She cannot claim this is gender when it was something that was done to both sexes. We also see her evidence further undermining her claims that Baldoni's motivation for privately inquiring about her weight was not meant to demean her as a woman, but to anticipate his own physical obligations. And then she basically says, after already mentioning that this didn't happen on set, this didn't happen with anyone remotely involved in the movie, it's not admissible, it's not competent evidence, and that Blake herself repeatedly raised concerns about her physical appearance. It's redacted here, but we know that she was worried about her size because she just had her fourth baby. She asked for certain scenes to be filmed at the end. We saw in a video I did not long ago that she got her way by simply refusing to show up in Vegas, where those scenes were supposed to have been filmed at the very beginning of filming. But we saw her long walls of texts about how she felt about her physical appearance. We saw his responses to those. She has not been able to produce anything because it doesn't exist where Justin himself criticized her physical appearance. Now we get into his referring to her wardrobe as sexy. But in the video footage, we see what she was wearing. It was an oversized fleece onesie. Her whole thing about him ogling her is ridiculous. It was a onesie, oversized fleece. This was not gendered. He said the same thing when referring to a male actor. And also we have lots of Blake speaking inappropriately about another male actor in the marketing of the film. This was probably Brandon. We have some redactions here, but we do know that Blake spoke about her wardrobe, wanting her wardrobe to look sexy. Multiple occasions. We have it in text. We have her saying it to the entire crew, talking about her shoes. They don't dispute that the word was used to describe a film devoted to adult themes, but it was not invoked to pit one gender against another. There is no evidence to suggest that any of this stuff was said to offend her based on her gender, that he was targeting her because she was a woman, and we have another redaction so we don't get the full meaning of this sentence. And as we've been saying all along, this conduct would not be acceptable in a typical office setting, but this isn't a typical office setting. This is a sexually charged movie from a sexually charged book where sex is simulated. She knew all of this when she entered into the contract. These are two professional actors playing out romantic partners. It simply cannot constitute discrimination. And then we have more of her own declaration describing other kissing scenes in the film as vital to conveying and we have that word redacted. Her complaint that Justin added intimate scenes fails for the same reasons. What are those? She does not and cannot dispute that she herself revised the script to increase we don't have the word, we're just going to have to guess there. We know that she was invited to discuss the intimate scenes with an intimacy coordinator, and she did not. And her accusations about the birth scene are exactly what she said. Absurd. She knew all along a birth scene was going to be filmed. There was no unscripted nudity. She was simply not nude. She had a gown, she had a prosthetic belly, and she had biker shorts on. And I love this remark at the end. Lively, a mother of 4, must have known people generally don't wear pants to give birth. If you know there's a birth scene in a movie, and you object to that, don't agree to make the movie, and then later try to say it was something bad. And speaking of this birth scene, I saw some disturbing comments on X that have picked up on Blake's sexualization of birth by referring to the scene of them holding their just-born baby and praying over it as Jamie appearing to be nude, straddling his wife in a tub. This is seconds after giving birth. Seconds! There is nothing sexual about this moment. Absolutely nothing. And anyone who thinks you can sexualize this moment is sick in the head, period. I mean, not to be graphic, but isn't the placenta still waiting to be delivered at this moment? This is still actively a birth situation. Was the cord even cut? What kind of births did Blake have? How does she have this so confused? Then we get to her other accusations toward Jamie, and this just proves that even after demanding and getting to watch the birth video in its entirety, no such scene exists as she claimed. Another bold-faced lie. And then we get into the unclean hands. She doesn't dispute that she shared her own views about intimacy with Baldoni during and something redacted about the film. You can't speak one way yourself and then sue someone for speaking the same way back to you. You just can't do it. Now, these incidents that she claims about Jamie, not only are they in dispute, but there's nothing showing that they were gender-based. There are 3 witnesses that testify that Justin asked Jamie to show Blake that birth video for non-gender-based reasons. They were discussions about the birth scene in the film. There are witnesses. And she admits something that's redacted. The other part is that after she objected, no one persisted in showing her the video. This video was shown to Justin, who is a male participant in the film, not gender-based. Blake had to admit that Jamie entered her trailer not for any gender-related purpose. It was there to discuss something that needed discussed, and it was there with her permission. He turned away from her as he was asked to do. Jamie does not remember looking at her. She said that he did, but again, we come back to her saying, I'm not saying you were trying to cop a look. Now we have in her opposition that she cited no evidence supporting her claim that she raised the incident with Heath, and we have redacted. I'm so sick of this redaction. Nor is there any evidence that she raised it during the call with the Sony executive a few days later when she redacted about production. So all of these lies of her claiming that she brought these to so-and-so's attention, not true. Her response to the summary judgment would have been the place to bring that evidence, and she didn't. And they mention that she omits something very important in her opposition. She includes the part, harassing conduct need not be motivated by sexual desire, but what she omitted is that it must be motivated by gender, and she is unable to make that showing. That's not a technicality. She can't make it because it didn't exist. Shapiro continues bulldozing her way through Blake's ridiculous claims. Now she gets into some of the cases that Blake cited. This incident, Bailey versus San Francisco District Attorney's Office. So what she's trying to say, because of the fact that alleged conduct must be persistent and pervasive, and that a single act cannot give rise to an actionable claim, she's trying to bring cases that say, oh, an isolated incident can give rise to an actionable claim. But the case she brings up is not like her case at all. This is a case of the N-word being spoken. As it says, a slur so universally recognized that its discriminatory intent cannot be denied. And continuing on that theme, it says that she doesn't even claim anything she personally experienced was sufficiently severe or pervasive to prove harassment. She largely ignores significant authority confirming her allegations are too mild. Then it mentions cases here. McSweeney is interesting because this is a Bravo case that Judge Lyman himself presided over, and he ruled that the allegations were too mild, and the claim failed. She dodges the undisputed critical fact that any alleged harassment ceased once she raised concerns, no issue arose, and no incident recurred throughout the remainder of filming. And then we see at the footnote that the other cases that she cited to claim that a single incident was enough actually do not involve a single incident, but they involve several derogatory racial comments and physical threats. This is not about race. And another one of the cases involved 2 years of false accusations and misconduct. So the cases that she's tried to argue on her behalf fail. More of things we've been saying all along. How can the conduct be severe or pervasive if it vanished once the issue was raised? So much so that Lively, advised by counsel, concluded that no formal HR process was warranted. Not that it didn't take place, but that it wasn't warranted. So these isolated incidents, unless they're extremely serious, and none of hers rose to that level, are not sufficient to create an actionable claim of harassment. And we also have, again, just have to say, these are not admissions that the things happened the way she claimed that they did. Those things are still in dispute. But this is, if you were to take her at her word, it still fails. Now it points to the codes that she relies on when it states that its intent that summary judgment is rarely appropriate in harassment cases. As a way to say this shouldn't even be up for discussion in summary judgment, they say that has no bearing on her Title VII claims, that it's just a legislative view, and that California courts have also confirmed that it does not mark a substantive change in California law. So she's misapplying a statement. But indeed, federal courts in California continue to grant summary judgment in FEHA cases where severity is not shown, and it gives a list of those, and points out that 2 comments about plaintiff's age is not sufficient. That was the decision made. She tries to bolster her claim by invoking the alleged experience of other women. How does that hold up? We see this doubt again. If they even occurred, they're not admitting these things occurred, but even if they did, this isn't something Blake even knew about prior to litigation, and that these events are supported only by rank hearsay or otherwise inadmissible evidence. And then they cite case law saying, and this is binding authority, this is Second Circuit, this is appellate court, unsupported claims must not be considered. Discrimination affords no claim to a person who experiences it by hearsay. So these other people that she's drug in that have come up with some way to supposedly support anything about this work environment, it's all hearsay. It adds little weight to her claims. Jenny Slate refers to a single instance in which Justin referred to her wardrobe, calling her pants sexy, something that was widely used on set, including by Blake herself, who actually began the conversation of calling wardrobe sexy. It was a one-off remark. Even though it was unwelcome, it's not so severe or pervasive as to give rise to a claim. It is undisputed that once Justin realized she didn't like it, it was acknowledged, and it was never repeated. And I have seen quite a number of videos come up of Jenny Slate in interviews saying and doing some pretty disgusting, filthy things. The woman is vile. Pretense that him calling her pants sexy was so offensive to her is just ridiculous. We've got her walking on stage, lifting her skirt, turning around and showing her underwear. We've got video of her in an absolutely see-through lace skirt, shaking her butt, zooming in on it. We've got her talking about taking her pants and underwear off, sitting on an interview sofa, raising her legs up, spreading them, and shaking them around and talking about this is what she does to get her partner to come and have sex with her. But yeah, him saying her leather pants were sexy must have been absolutely mortifying for her. Now we get into these ridiculous claims about yelling. What does that have to do with it? It has nothing to do with gender. It has nothing to do with sexual harassment. It has nothing to do with retaliation. And the person that describes the situation even noted that this was not something that was done only to women. It was done to men as well. So by their own admission, this is not gender-based. And hearing her describe these accusations, to me, it just shows how silly they are. Lively's references to verbal abuse supposedly experienced by another director on another set of a different film, this is Claire, I think, have nothing to do with the work environment at issue in this case. I mean, have these attorneys gone to law school? It's ridiculous what they've brought here and tried to pass off, and it just shows that they're pandering to PR. They know these things. And this supposed verbal abuse that this lady allegedly endured is only vaguely described, and there's no suggestion that it was sexual or gender-based. The claim about Colleen Hoover to say that she was not involved in the script and didn't receive dailies has no connection to her gender or to the on-set environment. Since when do authors of books that get turned into movies get to be involved in the script or receive dailies? Seriously, this stuff is outrageous. And this is mentioned again because it is so important. All of Blake's issues were resolved. She cannot show that the conditions of her employment changed. So there was no adverse action. There was no retaliation. This is another reason to dismiss her claims. And she argues that even though she herself has admitted that there were no objections during the second phase of filming or thereafter, that defendants' huffy and defensive reactions to Lively's behavior were themselves harassment. Her behavior was atrocious. Of course it made him huffy and defensive at times. But how does that raise to the level of harassment? Especially when she has already admitted that nothing happened in that second section of filming. The 2 occasions that she claims occurred were both during the first phase. So they weren't even in the second phase that she's talking about. An unfriendly conduct does not amount to change in the terms and conditions of employment. That's required to prove a hostile work environment. I'm sure he couldn't stand her. None of us would feel good about someone who was doing the things that she was doing. That doesn't mean it was a result of a complaint that never happened in the first place. And here we go. The Supreme Court has repeatedly stated the standards for judging hostility are sufficiently demanding to ensure that Title VII does not become a general civility code. As I said earlier, the courts are full enough. You can't just let this frivolous nonsense fill them up even more. This is coming from the Supreme Court, a place that of all the ones involved, I believe only Shapiro has actually been. We also know who started throwing the first stones. That's a matter of court record now. We know it was Blake. We know Leslie Sloan was leaking it. But she simply cannot prove any actionable retaliation. She's trying to insist that very little evidence is required. We saw that claim. But what she has is not enough to save her retaliation or her aiding and abetting, no matter how much she wants to say that she's made a prima facie showing, and that even if she has, Wayfarer has presented a clear, non-pretextual justification for their publicity efforts, which were a reaction to a media firestorm and not to any complaint by Lively months before. She claims she made these accusations in May of 2023. If they had gone out immediately then and hired Tag and hired Jed Wallace, she might have a survivable claim. But it didn't happen until she started leaking stuff herself to make the film look bad and to make Wayfarer look bad and to make Justin look bad. No material aspect of her employment changed for the worse. Her compensation did not decrease. Her role was not diminished. That's enough to defeat her FIHA claims. She points out how Blake is trying to evade the point by expanding her supposed employment to include post-filming activity as well as her campaign to get a PGA mark. She wasn't hired as an editor, director, or producer. The mere fact that she had any role in post-filming activity is proof that her responsibilities expanded, not contracted. Can you imagine her trying to tell the jury, I was retaliated against? And then, I got a PGA mark. I got to edit the whole film. I got to change some of the assistant directors. I got to change the music. But yeah, poor me, I was discriminated against. It's nonsense. And then we have her own words, because she can never shut her mouth, about how she described her accomplishments, and they're redacted here. The lunacy continues with her accusations about Hoover, when in fact, she actually became closer to Colleen and plotted together with her against Wayfarer. So her poor me, I was made to feel guilty and criticized to Hoover at that dinner. So she may have been angry about it, she may have been upset about it, but it's not actionable. Actions that do no more than subjectively upset the employee or are not to her liking are not adverse employment actions. And then it talks about all of the times that Colleen and Blake worked together afterwards. So she wasn't left in a bad light in Colleen's eyes. Obviously, that's when they became little besties and Blake started flying her around and adjusting her clothes. There is no material harm, no damages. And now we're talking about the CRA. Even if it was a binding agreement, which, it was not. And we'll talk more about that. But moving into this retaliation, these are reasonable defensive measures. And Blake cannot dispute that this happened outside the workplace and that in that arena, Blake chose it and exercised immense power within it. All of these times that Blake's team has accused the Wayfarer team of doing things for PR always make me laugh because they're so ridiculous. Look at mainstream media. Are they out there posting on behalf of Wayfarer? Are they saying anything nice or kind or even truthful to support the Wayfarer side? Or have they been blatantly ignoring the Wayfarer side and twisting everything in Blake's favor? And then it shows all the steps that Blake took, and she knew exactly what she was doing that was making Justin look bad, Wayfarer look bad, and the movie look bad. And as it says, documentary evidence shows Lively's husband redacted. It's driving me crazy. Unredact this stuff. But we saw a bunch of stuff that got released and some of the things that did become unredacted and unsealed that showed Ryan taking part in all of this. We all talked about how disgusted we are that Lyman dismissed the case against Ryan. He should have allowed this evidence to come first. And we see this referring to things that Blake did that caused a media furor. More of things we've been saying all along, that her opposition fails to identify a single factually false statement that defendants shared or promoted in response to this onslaught. If you're going to claim defamation, you can't point to things that people have said about you that are true. What are the things that have been said about Blake publicly? Most of them are actual videos of her speaking. None of these things are false. None of these things can be denied. None of these things have been misrepresented. They are actual videos or statements made by her in interviews. None of them are false. They're things that she brought upon herself. They claim multiple incidents, but they failed to say which ones or how. They say that they exposed her to criticism for past conduct, but none of these things were new and had not been in the public domain already before any publicity. These things all existed, were already out there. They didn't just come forth brand new. And then she says that they contended that she weaponized feminism and took the movie over. But that's undisputed. And we see some of her own claims. These are things she said in interviews herself that Wayfarer didn't even have to say. She says she was unfairly criticized for shifting the film's marketing strategy away from domestic violence. But it's undisputed that the film was always meant to raise awareness about domestic violence. We've seen lots of proof of that. We've also seen that when the marketing started going poorly, that Jamie sent an email and said, hey, we've got a problem here. Let's fix it. It's documented. It's undeniable. It is undisputed that Blake was criticized not simply for de-emphasizing domestic violence, but for simultaneously promoting her other projects and those of her husband as well. This is what they've been doing for years. The record is clear. Such criticisms appeared in the press, independent of any effort by defendants. This was the public saying, what? This is gross. Look at this. Not only that, Blake started her public statements about trouble on the set that we can still read today. That's what TAG was hired to deal with. That's what Jed Wallace was hired to deal with. It had nothing to do with sexual harassment claims that had never been made. She tries to shrink the temporal gap, and that's the time span between her supposedly having a protected activity with this supposed retaliation that she claims started in August 2024. By the way, Blake, as soon as people found out you were cast in the role, they were talking about you. Then when they saw you in your ridiculous wardrobe, they talked about you some more. And then it mentions how she has never claimed any of the additional events that she now relies upon. Things such as refusing to promote the film with Baldoni as activity intended to oppose discrimination. And there is no evidence any defendant understood them as such. You can't start making stuff up this late in the game. An action cannot constitute protected activity when there is no evidence the employer knew that the employee's opposition was based upon a reasonable belief that the employer was engaging in discrimination. It is undisputed defendants respected Lively's requests. Baldoni did not insist on promoting the film with her. So she's bringing in new claims she never mentioned. You can't do that. She never mentioned to her employer that she believed that there was discrimination. And he didn't insist. If she said don't be at the premiere, he didn't show up at the premiere with her. I mentioned this temporal gap a moment ago. She cannot show a direct link between the two because there isn't one that exists. Conspicuously lacking from the record is a single piece of evidence in which defendants say they are initiating a publicity campaign to get back at her for raising objections on set. Instead, she relies on messages in which defendants express concerns about her possible prospective activity and seek to prepare for the fallout. Defendants' conduct consistently resulted in Lively's gaining more power over the production, not less. But let's talk about that again. People like to say, oh, there's absolute proof there was a smear campaign. They were protecting themselves against the fallout of her complaining about other things that had nothing to do with sexual harassment. That's the connection that's missing, that the Blake stans just cannot understand. They never denied they prepared PR against the onslaught of her lying about them, but it had nothing to do with sexual harassment. It was all about trouble on the set. Blake started those public statements about trouble on the set, and we can still Read them today. That's what TAG was hired to deal with, not sexual harassment accusations. So in addition to there not being any report of sexual harassment, she cannot produce a single document that links it to sexual harassment and not the trouble on the set that she caused. It was not retaliation. It was the negative publicity that she and Leslie Sloan had started. She herself has to admit that Wayfarer didn't meet with TAG until July 25th, after the negative publicity had already begun, the negative publicity that she put out. She has to show that this protected activity was the but-for cause of Wayfarer's conduct. That means that they would not have hired this team but for the report of sexual harassment. That is not the case. They hired them because she was out there talking about the set. She cannot possibly meet the burden on this record, nor can she credibly argue that the defendants welcomed the media fracas as a pretext to attack her for her objections. Rather, undisputed evidence, including materials that Lively cites, shows that the defendants were terrified and doing everything they could to avoid a confrontation. And then they talk about how ridiculous it is that anything that was done post-litigation, so once she filed her complaint, she cannot claim that any of this is retaliation. It's a response to the litigation that they have every right to do. It has nothing to do with a workplace complaint about harassment many, many months before, over a year before. Now, this next bit about the independent contractor, I made a very detailed video about this a couple of months ago. I talked about these tests that are mentioned and what determines what is an independent contractor compared to an employee. It doesn't boil down to one simple thing. It's a multitude of things, but I showed charts, I showed case law, I showed many instances about how this is determined, and I'll link that one in comments so you can, if you didn't see it, you can go back and watch it. It's very specific, but she ignores her own extensive admissions, which are redacted here. She ignores her highly bespoke contract, even things like getting the production's location moved so it could be closer to her home. Her rights over many aspects of production. We saw her control the wardrobe, insisting on her own unilaterally imposed terms as a condition for going forward. As it says, it's difficult to imagine anyone having more control. They show the ridiculousness of the case law that she relies on, saying that it bears no resemblance, that that's the only authority that she puts out. And I believe this is one of the cases that I mentioned in my summary about these tests. This ballerina did not have control, but there was control over her performance and the entire show. Lively, by contrast, exercised tremendous control over not just herself, but the entire production. Not even just her own performance. She made rules over what they could do with Isabella. Blake didn't have standard employee benefits. She wasn't subject to taxes. Then she points to the actor's loan agreement, and they say nonsense. The terms of that were never fully negotiated, and the agreement was never signed. It talks about how the courts have a comprehensive multi-factor analysis. Again, that's all mentioned in my previous video that talked about these standards. It lists what a lot of those are. I'm not going to repeat them now. Instead, I will direct you to that video where I went over this very, very detailed. And this page as well, it talks about the Reed test, the Borello test. I discussed those in detail. And I love this final paragraph. Far from a typical employee, Lively independently contracted through her own private business entity and exercised tremendous control while maintaining the right to work on other projects and for other businesses. If she is not an independent contractor, then there is no such thing as an independent contractor. Really, he will be doing himself such a disservice if he allows her to be considered an employee. It's going to mess things up for him in his court to time indefinite. There will be no independent contractor if she doesn't meet that standard. How much more control can a person have? She cannot prove failure to investigate a claim. She knew how to raise concerns. She did raise concerns, and though Jamie and Justin dispute her version of events, they still acceded to her demands. And yet she says that they failed to implement any corrective measures. By her own admission, they agreed to her set of requested protections. She also said that all subsequent filming, everything went fine. She cannot dispute that she declined to pursue formal HR process. She declined letting California investigate her claims when she filed her CRD complaint. She did not let the EEOC investigate her claims when she filed that complaint. And now she wants to rewrite history. claiming that an investigation didn't happen because Heath didn't want, and that's redacted. It's apparently something that came from Alex Sachs, and they say that it's a twist of her testimony and it's not supported by competent evidence. Sachs' private speculation about Jamie's motives is not admissible evidence. It's more of her nonsensical hearsay by people whose own messages clearly show that they also wanted to take control of this movie and push Justin out. We saw this woman say that. She wanted Justin's job. Everybody wanted Justin's job. It means absolutely nothing legally. It only gives a clearer picture of what was going on with these awful people. And how seriously can you take someone who openly said they wanted to take his job? Now we move on to more of her legal arguments on other claims and how they all fail as well. And the point comes up again about the mistake in her complaint. So this alter ego theory that they've tried to use to heal the fact that they didn't name the right defendant. And they say this fails. Wayfarer was not a party to the actor loan-out agreement. They say these must be dismissed. They were not defended on summary judgment and therefore are abandoned. But back to the actor loan-out agreement, they say it's not binding or enforceable. We have a lot of redactions here, so we don't know exactly what they're talking about for sure, other than they're saying that this fails. The next point they bring up, and it's the last one we're going to talk about today, is about judicial estoppel. Now, I've talked about this a long time ago, so I want to go over it again before we read from the document. So judicial estoppel is where the court says you cannot flip-flop. You cannot change from something that you said previously to something different. It comes with rules. We see this more often in things like bankruptcy court, where someone has claimed, for example, that they do not own certain assets. And then later they try to bring a case against someone for harming an asset that they, in a previous case, claimed they didn't have. It can occur within a case. 3 things must be true. 1, that the earlier position was clear and inconsistent with what they're claiming now. Not only that, the earlier position must have been accepted by the court. So the court must have relied on it in a judgment or an order. And 3, the new position causes prejudice or an unfair advantage or harm to the other side. Now keep those in mind, because she's claiming that Wayfarer needs to be stopped from arguing that this actor's loan agreement is not binding. And they're saying it has to have been adopted in some way by the court, and that never happened. So they're saying in the motion to dismiss that he granted, the court rejected their claim. It was not adopted. It was not relied upon. It was rejected. Second, the prior pleading was not inconsistent with the current position. It also pointed out that it had never been signed. It also asserted a claim for breach of the covenant of good faith and fair dealing that was never specifically alleged to rest on the ALA. Third, the defendants gained no unfair advantage. So none of the 3 things that must be met are met. In fact, in the dismissal of the claim, the court noted that the ALA had never been signed. The court left leave for this to be repled, but they did not replead the claim. All the criticism that's gone to Wayfarer, and all along they were playing things smart by doing things like this, not mentioning something that would give her time and the opportunity to amend her complaint. They have always held that she did not sign her employment contract. Now this condition precedent becomes very important. This refers to a line in the contract that states that the contract is not valid without being properly signed. Now some people have argued that if both sides proceed as if the contract was signed, that in a court's eyes, it's binding. However, what they're saying is that did not happen. Contract conversations continued throughout all of the filming, with them attempting to get her to sign. We've seen documentation about that. Not only that, we see Jamie specifically giving Blake more time to edit the film without making signing the draft a condition of the concession. But he was clear. He said, as for the future resolution of the contract, we will stand by in hopes that we come to a conclusion soon. They never just simply dropped it. It always stayed in negotiations. They were always trying to get her to resolve that contract claim. They never just said, okay, we're waiving this. Blake also falsely claims that It Ends With Us movie did not dispute the execution condition had been waived. They say the opposite is true, that when she tried to strike that condition, in these proceedings that they rejected that edit and that she cannot dispute the fact that though she labels it misleading, claiming that they could have been more explicit in their rejection, it ends with us Motion Picture was unequivocal that it was not waiving the condition. When she tried to insert a phrase, it's redacted, into the draft, they rejected it. They did not waive via their conduct, they say, because Lively's own evidence confirms that because it was not finalized when principal photography commenced, her lawyer insisted that until such time that the long form is fully executed, our client will continue to proceed in reliance upon the terms of the negotiated deal memo. In other words, they were relying on the offer letter. They were not waiving. Furthermore, they bring case law, and this is binding. This is from courts of appeals in New York and California, that both New York and California law require unequivocal expression of intent to waive, especially where, as here, the contract expressly bars modifications not signed and in writing. So these courts are over Lyman's head. He has no choice but to rule in agreement to them, especially the Second Circuit. And Blake simply cannot show that they ever intended to waive. Given her pre-dispute assertion that pending execution of the ALA, the parties would perform under the offer letter, and her repeated unsuccessful attempts to remove the condition that we just saw, and they showed where in the documents this happened, and the movie's continual request that she sign the agreement. Never did they ever waive it. So they say it was never binding. She does not meaningfully grapple with the undisputed evidence showing that they did not intend to be bound absent of fully executed writing. They show her weak claim that they say is irrelevant, that her argument fails because she cannot meaningfully dispute that performance occurred under the offer letter, which set forth the key terms between the parties. In any case, they say performance is only one factor for determining whether an agreement is formed and is not decisive. So now the judge has to go over all of this information and determine whether or not this contract is enforceable. But it sounds like they're bringing a lot of evidence here that she has not brought to show that it's not enforceable. Her argument that the CRA suggests the parties understood the ALA was already a binding agreement is flatly contradicted by the record. It is undisputed that negotiations over numerous provisions of the ALA, including the provision making execution a condition precedent, continued after the CRA was signed. So even if the CRA was signed, they weren't just going on that, because these conditions were still being negotiated afterwards, with neither side manifesting an understanding that terms of the ALA were finalized. She herself had to admit that 20% of the terms were still being negotiated when the CRA was executed. So if the CRA manifested the parties' understanding that the ALA was a done deal, there would have been no need for roughly 6 more months of negotiations, nor any reason for Lively to decline to sign. And it sounds like they've got the upper hand in this argument with lots and lots of evidence. We are not all the way through that, but just for the sake of time, we're going to stop it here, so that I can get this out to you, and we'll pick up from there later.